a memo to every employee in DEA and put them on notice that this kind of conduct
My
was not acceptable.
question must have been ambiguous because I wasn't talking about future conduct. I was talking about past conduct. What punishment did you recommend for conduct that happened in the past?
Under the civil service law, I cannot recommend a penalty. I can't intervene in the disciplinary process. I can't even make a recommendation.
What
to the
does it take to
deciding
get,
official.
what would it, hypothetically, what would it take to get fired as a DEA agent? Because the agents I used to work with were worried about using their car to go pick up dry cleaning. They were actually worried about using their OGV to pick up dry cleaning. They were worried about being disciplined. So apparently that world has changed. Do you know whether any of the prostitutes were underage?
I don't know that.
Would that impact whatever recommendation you might have in terms of a sanction?
I don't recommend the sanction. I can't fire. I can't recommend a penalty. There's a guide that the deciding officials abide by, and they have a penalty guide that they look at, and the penalty guide for this kind of activity is anything from reprimand to removal.
How about security clearance? Do you have any impact over that, whether or not an agent has a security clearance?
No, there's adjudicative guidelines, and that has to be adjudicated by the security
Honestly,
people.
what power do you have? You have to work with agents over whom you can't discipline and have no control, and you have no control over the security clearance. What the hell do you get to do?
What I can do is build on and improve mechanisms to make sure that the outcome is what we believe the outcome should be. And that is what happened in Cartagena. That is what's going to happen moving forward.
Inspector General Horowitz, I find that stunning. Let me ask you this: Did the agents know that the cartels were providing the prostitutes?
What we found, Congressman, from looking in the file was that they should have known, given their trained law enforcement agents, and they were dealing with corrupt law enforcement, local law enforcement, that was providing them with the prostitutes as well as the various gifts.
Were they supposed to be investigating these cartels?
They were.
So they are receiving prostitutes from cartels that they are supposed to be investigating. And she can't fire those agents. Do you agree with her? She can't fire them?
I think as a matter of Title V, she can't directly intervene and fire them. I do think one of the concerns we outline in the report as to DEA and the other three agencies is how they adjudicate these cases. They undercharge them in some instances. And so at DEA, for example, sexual harassment, if you're charged with that, there's only one punishment: removal. But if you're charged with conduct unbecoming or poor judgment, which isn't even actually a category, then you've got a range of penalties. And so one of the issues, as you know, as a former prosecutor, is how you charge the case. And that has a consequence.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't know what would need to be done, but I, like my friend from South Carolina, find it stunning that you can solicit prostitutes. Administrator Leonhardt, do we know whether any of the prostitutes were underage? Do we know whether any of them were part of any human trafficking rings?
Because the Bogota case happened a decade ago, there were no interviews of prostitutes. On the more recent one, the Cartagena one, it did not identify an age for the prostitute involved.
Mr. Chairman, I would just find it impossible to explain to any reasonable-minded person how an agent cannot be disciplined for soliciting prostitutes from drug cartels that they were ostensibly investigating. I find that stunning.
If the gentleman will yield, if somebody murdered somebody, could you fire him?
If someone murdered someone, there would be criminal charges, and that's how they'd be fired.
But if they were, could you take away their security clearance?
The office's security programs can review security clearances and take their clearances, just as they did with the 3 agents in the Cartagena incident.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Gentlemen, yield for just a second. I'm sorry, I heard you say that there's one thing you could actually fire somebody for, which is sexual harassment. So let me see if I get this correct, Mr. Horowitz, Mrs. Leonard. If I flirt with a coworker in the office and that constitutes sexual harassment, I can be fired, but I can take an underage hooker from a cartel I'm investigating and you can't fire me. Is that what we're talking about here?
Actually, Congressman, if you charge the offense, removal is a possibility. If you charge something less, conduct unbecoming, or poor judgment, you don't charge what actually occurred, that's when the ability to discipline is limited. And that's the concern we found, as you know, in our report.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman, both from South Carolina. We'll now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to focus a little bit about the possible security risks from these sex parties. And on page 15 of the OPR report, it says the following. It says, Mr. Corroborator 2 stated he believed that Mr. Corroborator 1 gained information from the U.S. agents by getting their guard down through the use of prostitutes and paying for parties. Mr. Corroborator 1 bragged about the parties with prostitutes and how he sold relationship closeness with agents to Mr. Corroborator 2. And then Mr. Corroborator 1 said he could easily get the agents to talk. So, Ms. Neihart, do you believe actual information was compromised through these sex parties?
There's no evidence that that any was compromised, but the concern is that participating in this kind of behavior, bringing foreign nationals, bringing prostitutes to your GLQ, bringing them around other agents, all of those are security risks.
Doesn't the report itself provide evidence that you had agents in compromised positions, that at least foreign officials believed that the agents were compromised and they could get the agents to talk? Did you do an investigation? How do you know that agents didn't say something that they maybe should not have said or disclose some information they should not have?
Reading the report, one of the concerns was that the agents got very close to these 2 corrupt Colombian National Police, and that the Colombian National Police were providing prostitutes and gifts to get in the good graces of the agent, and that's about the furthest that it goes.
Did you then do an investigation as to what information may or may not have been leaked?
The OPR investigation, because it was 10 years after the fact, did not identify any instances, and in fact, the agents were all out of country by the time it was investigated. But
So
that
it's
is
possible that
major
information
concern.
was leaked or compromised.
Absolutely, that's a major concern.
So let me focus again on this discipline issue. When I served active duty in the Air Force and still in the reserves as a JAG, I dealt with the Douglas factors, and I understand some of the restrictions that you have because we're a civil service system. The FBI is not under Title V. DEA agents, like FBI agents, go undercover. They're law enforcement. Any reason not to move the DEA out of Title V?
We would entertain any look at that, any exemption that could be given so that an administrator or director can take action and make sure that only the people with outstanding reputations and ethics are employed by the agency.
If the deciding officials make a decision you don't like, can you do anything with that decision?
I can't do anything with the decision, but I can do what I did last year, and that is put on notice for the entire workforce, not any one particular case, put on notice for the entire workforce that this behavior is unacceptable, and that I ordered the deciding officials and the Board of Conduct to consider significant discipline to include up to removal for behavior in these areas moving forward.
Now, even though there are civil service protections for sort of the rank and file, when something goes badly wrong and it's a climate issue, a cultural issue, what happens is leadership resigns or gets fired. So, for example, in the Air Force, when there was problems with some of the nuclear weapons we had, even though the Secretary of the Air Force at the time, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force at the time really didn't know about it, wasn't aware, but because those things happened, they were both removed. Secret Service, their head is gone. Do you believe it's a climate issue? And if it's a climate issue, do you believe then maybe instead of focusing just on the rank and file, maybe you need leadership changed or removed?
We have changed leadership. We have a different set of leaders within DEA now than we did a decade ago. And I believe that moving forward with a better system to deal with discipline, and moving forward with, instead of looking at what the discipline was in the past that was doled out to individuals who took part in this kind of behavior, the deciding officials and the Board of Conduct has the clear ability now to reset.
Recommend for conduct that happened in the past.
Under the civil service law, I cannot recommend a penalty. I can't intervene in the disciplinary process. I can't even make a recommendation.
What
to the
does it take to
deciding
get,
officials.
what would it, hypothetically, what would it take to get fired as a DA?
A memo to every employee in DEA and put them on notice that this kind of conduct
My question must have been ambiguous because I wasn't talking about future conduct. I was talking about past conduct. What punishment did you
have. They have a penalty guide that they look at, and the penalty guide for this kind of activity is anything from reprimand to removal.
How about security clearance? Do you have any impact over that? Whether or not an agent has a DEA agent? Because the agents I used to work with were worried about using their car to go pick up dry cleaning. They were actually worried about using their OGV to pick up dry cleaning. They were worried about being disciplined. So apparently that world has changed. Do you know whether any of the prostitutes were underage?
I don't know that.
Would that impact whatever recommendation you might have in terms of a sanction?
I don't recommend the sanction. I can't fire. I can't recommend a penalty. There's a guide that the deciding officials abide by, and they have